Welcome. Thank you, Morgan, for the invitation to lead this all-women STAR panel. My name is Sandra Phillips. I will be your guide today. I'm dialing in from the unceded territory of the Sechelt and Squamish Nation, just outside of Vancouver, Canada. And just before we get started, a couple of things. One is we have a Q&A, so if you have any questions at any time, just plop them in and we'll pick them up. We also have 2 polls, so please vote. It'll make it more interesting for all of us. And then the last thing is the chat function should also be enabled. So if you just want to mention who you are, where you're dialing in from, and why you're interested in the bike revolution for lower density cities, that would be amazing, because obviously then there's a bit more community going on. I'm super pleased to lead this panel and be joined by Ashley Finch, who is the micromobility coordinator with the Department of Transportation in Atlanta, Jennifer Dungs, Global Head of Mobility, EIT, Eno Energy, and Cassandra McCleary, Research and Education Project Manager with Copenhagen ICE. They'll introduce themselves in a minute and their work, but before we do that, I'll just want to set the stage real quick. So I, apart from being your guide today, I'm the founder and CEO of MoveMe, and we focus on shared mobility. I've been in the space for 13 years, and I've worked on about 80 projects globally, a third of which are in the micromobility space. So e-bikes, e-scooters, e-mopeds, smaller vehicles, essentially. If you ask me, if you had asked me a couple of years ago, can they join? I would have said yes, maybe, actually, maybe not. In the last couple of years, we've had a number of micromobility projects on our side that are in lower density areas. So I think I'm saying now yes, but. And my first big but is something that I'm experiencing here on the Sunshine Coast quite personally. So I moved outside of Vancouver. It's a community of 50,000 people spread across quite a far distance. And the biggest complaint, and why, quite honestly, we can't even start an e-bike share, is because there's no safe infrastructure. So that's probably what comes to most people's mind when you talk about lower density and we just lack infrastructure, so we can't be done. Now, on the flip side, and this is what I want to share, there is projects that actually work quite well. Now, these are not bike projects, they're different micromobility projects, but I did want to share that it can work. So we work with a group called Sprawl out of that serves the Okanagan Valley. Okanagan Valley is a big tourist destination. Super small communities, 3 small communities, people drive with their cars. And so you can imagine what happens. There's an influx, a triple, sometimes influx of cars into a community that is not built for that. And they don't want them to drive around while they're. So the micromobility provider Sparrow essentially has teamed up with hospitality and has placed their vehicles right at the hotel. So when people arrive, they know, they see it and they can easily switch and then move around without having to use their cars. Another example is Hello Scoot out of Tahiti, which we also work with, which is, I wish I could go to Tahiti to see it in person, but I can't. But what they have done, obviously they serve tourists, right? It's Tahiti. But the other thing they've done, which I think is super important, and the lesson learned also from car sharing, they've found an anchor user, a group that has a dedicated use that is resident, like a resident user. And in their case, it's the military base. So they have military people come in, they still want to go and have, go to the beach, have a bite to eat when they're off duty, and they use it, they're heavy users. So that balances, revenue, but utilization as well. So I have a big yes, but as an answer, but I would love to hear from my panelists what they have done and how they see this develop. And maybe Jennifer, we can start with you and we'll just go around the table. Introduce yourself, your work, what works, what doesn't.
Thank you. Thanks, Sandra, and thanks to all of you who are participating today in the webinar. So I'm Jennifer. I'm actually calling in from Stuttgart, Germany, but originally a US person coming from Detroit. And I'm coming from Eno Energy. We're one of the leading climate tech investors, and we're focused on investing in hardware and on sustainable energy topics. And as we all know, transportation is about 25% of the CO2 contribution. So mobility is one of the focus areas that we're investing. And in the last 2.5 years, Sandra, we invested in 13 different vehicle form factors for this last mile, because as we see, of course, these e-scooters have been popping up, the kickboard scooters, but that's not serving every use case that we all have. And actually, interesting enough, with women on the panel, we do have statistics that show that we're often carrying more things, different types of things. And we also have a different mobility pattern in certain cases. So we're focused on investing in these different form factors, investing in the infrastructure. And maybe another important thing is that when you talk about shared micromobility, we're thinking about this a little bit more broadly. So we're not just thinking about moving people, but we're also thinking about the goods that need to be moved in the city. And for example, how can we use one common battery that's standardized for Cassandra's personal e-bike, Sandra, when you do a bike share, and when Ashley is, doing deliveries for Amazon in a cargo bike? Like, how can all of those batteries in that infrastructure be shared to have higher utilization? And those are some of the topics we're focused on, and also looking up and down the value chain. And when it comes to the question today of these lower density areas, we think that you have to be, I would give you the same answer. It's a yes, but on the yes part, I think it's a very important topic, because we just started a project in about 1 hour north of New York, and it's the village of Ozanine. And in this area, it's a lower income, higher immigrant population where they just need other options besides an auto. And they need access to mobility to have access to jobs and things like that. So there's a real need that needs to be served. And but like you said in your example, I thought was quite interesting, to find those heavy users or those exact use cases. And once we have more knowledge on that, we also plan to replicate that in 5 other cities nearby. But that's sort of it in a nutshell. Maybe one last point. We're really motivated about the topic because we also did a study about 1 year ago to see the impact this would have. And in Europe, we looked at the 100 top cities that we could implement this. And with taking this percentage from less than 1% up to 10% with these types of form factors, you could reduce 30 million tons of CO2. You could create what we calculated 90,000 football fields in the city of Paris of green space. So it's really big and meaningful numbers just by getting us a little bit higher on the contribution from those form factors. So we'll be quiet now and love to hear from the rest.
Yeah, no, but I think it's really interesting how you play around, the investment, the form factor, I think is really crucial. And then also like actually being involved in projects and showing that it's possible. And so with that, actually, Ashley, maybe you can share a little bit of the work you've been doing in Atlanta, which in most people's mind is definitely not associated with bikes or, dense. Some pockets are dense, but there's also a lot of non-dense. So maybe share what you've been doing in your city and how it's been working.
Sure, happy to. Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley Finch, Shared Micromobility Coordinator at the City of Atlanta Department of Transportation, and I've been in this role about a year. And prior to that, I was not working with shared micromobility. So while I'm a big cyclist and lover of e-bikes and e-scooters, it was all very new for me. And so Atlanta, just so everyone sort of has an idea, we are, like Sandra said, we are a city of about 500,000 people, and we have a lot of folks that commute into the city. We also have both docked bike share and dockless e-bikes and e-scooters. So we sort of have both models happening in the city. And we do have pockets of density in our downtown and midtown areas, but a lot of our other neighborhoods are a little more spread out. There are sort of gaps in that density, and sort of more sparse land uses. And then once you get sort of to the outskirts of the city limits, it is mostly single family homes and very much auto-oriented infrastructure, which makes it very hard to have a shared micromobility system that, you know, traverses all of our neighborhoods and all of our city and serves all of our communities. So I would say that's definitely been a challenge for us in Atlanta, trying to solve that access and equity piece when we are often seeing that our highest ridership is in our densest areas, which also, you know, is where our bike infrastructure is right now. And so I think, you know, as we'll talk about a lot, infrastructure is a huge piece of the puzzle. And so for just a couple of fun stats about shared micromobility in Atlanta, we've had a program since 2019. And it's kind of gone through some iterations, as all of them have. But for dockless, well, the bike share was from 2016, and then the dockless came in 2019. And we started off just with like a free for all with 9 or 10 companies. And so that was not very well received by the public. There were no parking corrals. Our right of way was kind of a mess. And so we developed an annual permit model, which is what we still have. And we're kind of seeing right now, as we've been doing this sort of extended pilot, and what's next. So we're trying to answer a lot of these questions ourselves of how do we solve this problem where we want our shared micromobility system to be something that people can use for their day-to-day transportation. We want it to also be something that people can use for recreation and tourism. And we also want it to be equitable. And how do you put all of those puzzle pieces together? So that's really what I've been focusing on in my work. And we're eventually hoping in the next year or so to sort of go to RFP and like look at a new model. And I'm still trying to figure out exactly what that model is going to look like.
I find it very interesting. Like most cities have gone through this like iteration, and I actually think it hasn't ended. It's still trying to figure out, like when Paris, one of the cities that has been most successful in bringing not just micromobility, but generally a shift towards bikes, is thinking about closing it, you know, then I'm like, I really don't think we have figured out how to make this work, which is actually why it's super exciting that Cassandra is dialing in from Paris. And I know we talked quite a bit about shared pieces, but obviously this webinar is not just about shared, it's also just about the bike revolution in general. And I think with Copenhagen and your organization does a lot of work in like just shifting people into like active transportation. So maybe share a little bit what you're doing. Yeah. And if you don't mind, I would like to run the first poll because I feel like we're starting to bias the audience a little bit. You still get to introduce yourself while we're doing that. So if Morgan, you can kick off the first poll. We just want to know what you're thinking. Does shared micromobility even have a place in lesser dense areas? We already kind of tainted your ideas. So maybe go back to what your idea was before you get on. And then Cassandra, yeah, maybe tell us a little bit also outside of shared, how we should think about this.
Yep, definitely. Well, first of all, thank you everyone for being here and for CoMotion for organizing. So my name is Cassandra and I work at Copenhagen Eyes. It's a urban planning consultancy firm that works on bicycle urbanism. So what does that mean? Basically, we touch anything that links to bikes. So yeah, when we said we're expanding on shared mobility, we're talking more about the whole picture of everything that's linked to planning and cycling. So bicycle plans, bicycle strategies, infrastructure design, wayfinding. What is the communication and branding strategy for a bicycle network? How do we communicate it to residents? How do we create in our policies, you know, is it training schools? Is it what all goes into helping this modal shift that can happen in different cities? And we work at, we're based in Paris now. We were founded in Copenhagen, no surprise. We're now in Paris because there's just a lot of action happening here, but we work internationally. So we've worked on projects, small scale to planning the cycling and transit at an event space for like the World's Fair, all the way up to working in Detroit on their bicycle plan, and then working with large metropolitan areas on their whole regional plan. So niche in that we work on bikes, but generally we're looking at the fact that bicycle-friendly cities are more human-friendly cities, are healthier cities, and working on making them more equitable. So it's the bike sort of as a tool to access a lot of these things. And I guess we're interested in this rural area because we're looking at, that's a big question. We talk a lot about cities already. Paris gets written up all the time, but we can't fully make this transition happen if we don't think about smaller cities and less dense areas. So we've already worked on a project called BTB, and it's a European funded project that was in 5 different countries. And the goal was to work on intermodal transit between trains and bikes. So there were small towns in northern Italy, there were small towns in Barcelona, bigger places. And basically what we saw from all of it, so lesson was that once we start adding bicycle resources, parking, showers, lockers, a fluid system with rental bikes at the other end, we saw that in all scales, small towns to large places, that there was more cycling and more people on the trains and fewer people riding cars. So it was a big lesson learned was if you start designing and making resources, it increases, and it included smaller areas. We were impressed to see that in a tiny town in Italy, there was this much increase. So it was a big telltale sign. So for me, the question, can less dense areas be included? 100%. Do we approach it differently? Yes. Are there different tools? Of course, but there's definitely a future there. It's just not the same approach as we take in Paris or Berlin. And we've also worked on a regional plan for the Grand Est region of France, which is Strasbourg and the surrounding area, which is this lesson learned here was thinking at the regional level helps us to include smaller towns. So it's looking at a whole bicycle network and bicycle highways that aren't just, disjointed, as Ashley mentioned in Atlanta, that it's disconnected. It's thinking, how can we connect these smaller towns to important areas of education and opportunities for work? But if you don't think at that regional scale, you're not going to start thinking with that approach. And then lastly, we're really interested now because we're working on a project in Normandy that's on a small coastal town with limited access to trains and other sort of transit, and they really want to become a bicycle-friendly area. So it's a project we're working on now, thinking about how bicycle tourism can link in, but also just how do you do this? It's a different approach, different size city. So that's a bit of a global look at what we're doing, but
and I think it's super interesting because it's this I think we heard now from everyone, it's just you got to think about it differently, right? It's not that it can't be done. And I love that you just brought in the interregional piece, because that's to my very early example today of like, personally, I'm now in a community that is tied to a lot of other communities, but they're far apart, and you've got to start thinking regionally, and that comes with its own set of challenges, like how do you fund the cycling highway across different municipalities? Who takes the lead? If you have to get the ministry involved, which is our case, how do you get them involved together with the local communities? It's a whole different ballgame, really. So I'm really glad you brought that can also be done. I do want to share the poll. I know that we have the results. There we go. Yeah, see, okay. I think we have 72% also think it can be done. There's a few are like, no, never, will never happen. And then if there's a group that thinks if we increase vehicle density, just add more vehicles and have a certain density, which, in shared mobility, I shouldn't say that's a number one rule, but that's what everybody always talks about. Let's just bring, especially if you have the free floating model, right? Let's just bring more vehicles, which I sit often on the operator side and help them financially possible to make that work, to be very transparent. So I think it's interesting. As I said, we may have tainted the audience a little tiny bit with our intro, but I do want to pick up on that kind of vehicle. We talked about vehicle form factor, adding more vehicles, but also, and this is going back also, Cassandra, to Copenhagen, you don't just work on electric, you also work on a regular. So why does it make sense? Or what's the opportunity? Maybe that's the better question. What's the opportunity now that we do have more form factors, and especially more electric form factor? Why is that maybe an opportunity, and maybe why is also not? Ashley, I know that Landa, you really also work a lot on safety and vision zero, which obviously if you shift the large population or try to shift the population over to, new devices is a big challenge. What are your thoughts on that, like the electric opportunity we have here?
Yeah, so from a safety perspective, like I mentioned, in Atlanta, we have pockets of density, pockets of safe, protected bike infrastructure, but it is very disjointed. And so something that I've heard from the public and from users of the e-bikes and the e-scooters that we have in the city is that often they feel safer using the electric devices because the speeds are a little higher. They're able to get up hills a little faster, carry cargo a little bit easier. And so it does sort of offer this extra sort of connection between infrastructure to get there a little quicker, to not feel as many conflicts with cars going uphill when you're carrying a lot of cargo, you're carrying your kids. And so I do think that electric devices offer something in regards to safety in that aspect. But, at the end of the day, what is most important is we need to be building infrastructure that connects, all of our already well done protected infrastructure within the city. And we need to be making crosstown networks, and we need to be looking at safety projects in a lot of areas that have been underinvested in, where we see very low shared micromobility ridership just because it's not safe to use the devices there, or we see a lot of sidewalk usage, which, is a clear indication that there's an issue with the infrastructure if people don't feel safe riding in the street. And so while I do see a lot of opportunity, and I feel like the shared devices specifically are giving us a lot of really good data about, where the networks are disjointed, overwhelmingly, the majority of our rides are on the Atlanta Beltline, which is our major cycle path throughout the city. And the second largest sort of ridership that we're seeing is on roads connected to that infrastructure. So it's pretty much the majority of our rides are people connecting to our safe infrastructure or using our safe infrastructure. And so, the data is there. Like, if you have it, people will use it. And so it's just, how can we be better at, speeding up project delivery and getting through some of those bureaucratic hurdles. And I think that will both really increase our local ridership, but also increase equity and access to both the shared devices and cycling in general in Atlanta.
Yeah, and infrastructure it keeps coming up, as I said. That's a key topic. That you mentioned, I know Copenhagen works a lot on also the wayfinding and educational piece, and especially with bringing in the electric devices, which go faster and cause often conflict. And one of the researchers out of UBC calls it the unicorn effect, right? As soon as the device looks very different and there is more form factors, it becomes like this unicorn, and I don't want the unicorn, please, on my path. This is just for, whatever bikes. How do you deal with that? And what are maybe some tools also on the wayfinding side and education side to think about?
Yeah, I mean, electric micromobility is one part of the whole micromobility image. And when we're looking at cities, we're designing for speeds that are not necessarily as fast as we see e-bikes going. And actually, most of the bike fleets here, they're stopped at 20 or 25 kilometers an hour. So which is the speed that you can get to on a bike, like I get on my normal pedal bike. So we've already said it 1,000 times, infrastructure is really important. And when you design good infrastructure, it includes bike lanes that are wide enough. Ideally, you want to have two cargo bikes be able to pass each other safely. So that's, if you have that as a standard, which we can argue about other things and how they're implemented, but the width of lanes is really important because it allows for someone who's on a pedal bike who might not be as fast to comfortably ride, while someone on a much faster e-bike can pass them without having conflict. Afterwards, in cities, you could, if you have, having limits at 25 kilometers an hour, when you're also limiting here all through Paris, it's 30 kilometers an hour max So to have e-bikes going much faster than the cars are allowed to go in really dense urban areas, that's something we can limit with speeds like that. But then when you just get out of the city, you can have perhaps that changes. Or I mean, I'm not a proponent of putting in big speed limits anywhere. That's not what I'm suggesting entirely. But first off, we can design infrastructure that's wide enough to have space for different speeds, whether it's because of the electric aspect or not. And then even in certain places like the Netherlands, they're actually testing bicycle highways that are separate lanes for electric bikes, so that there is less conflict between users, so that everyone feels comfortable and everyone feels safe, because ultimately safety and feeling safe is one of the biggest things that prevents people from cycling. We did a study on women in Lille in France, and it was over 60% of the participants said that they often or always fear an accident when they're on their bike. And then the numbers with that showed that where they added new bicycle infrastructure that was safe and secured, we saw a big increase in the number of cyclists. But if you broke it down, there was a huge increase in women and the types of in younger children cycling. So it's really a question of, if you design for all types of bikes, electric or not, you're going to increase ridership across the board.
Right. I want to kick off, I am noticing the time, so I want to kick off the second poll, because one of the discussions we had when we prepared for this call was also like, what exactly do we need to increase? We already talked about infrastructure, we talked about a few other things, but there's things that we haven't talked about. So safe infrastructure is one, incentives and subsidies, especially in lower dense area where maybe it's a bigger shift for people to get out of their cars. Education, to community education, community ambassadors, so people that look like me or you that use it, and then co-creation. I think, Jennifer, you talked a lot about data. Maybe you can elaborate while people are voting, just for everybody to know you can select more than one, okay? You don't just have to pick one here. But Jennifer, maybe you can talk a little bit about the co-creation, because that was really at the heart of your Ossingi project.
Yeah, and I'll also just say a hello to Evan Castiglioli from CityFi, who's one of our partners on that project. So hi, Evan, thanks for joining. Yeah, I think with this project, with all the people involved, what this started as was co-creating together with the village. And what the first action points really were going around and bringing on board different community partners. So it started from this community partner approach to really identify what we talked about earlier a little bit, which would be who's most in need of this kind of solution. And what we also found very early on is that bike share is not enough. That's not the solution. The solution. We also needed to have an e-bike library. And we also needed to have options for lease to own, because we already could tell that in this community, it wasn't a one size fits all scenario. And Sandra, you asked this last question about the e-bikes. Well, we can tell you quite easily, a pedal bike is not possible in that topography. It's just not. It's hard to even walk up the hill. So I think an e-bike actually makes transport between different key centers possible that people without a car actually would not have otherwise. But part of this community outreach and design of the program was also that, and this is now to Cassandra, what you had just mentioned, there needed to also be education or a training to feel safe with this product. It has quite a lot of power, and not everybody was comfortable also going up or down hills, frankly, with that. And so training is also a big piece, as well as these ambassadors, what you said, people who look like us or look like your brother, sister, whoever, that are showing different demographics that are using these products. So yeah, that's a key part for us to continue to evolve the program. And I got to say, that's one thing that I like about this program is that they're giving us the space to incorporate the lessons learned. And what we also put in was what was called a incubator, a replication incubator, where at the second step, we'll invite and go to the cities nearby and say, hey, would this also be relevant for your city? And how would a design look like? Bring them in, to, again, at an early planning stage. And so hopefully with this approach, we can be successful at offering something that enables high utilization, and then all the other benefits come after that.
I think that's key, especially because we're like, so many large urban centers have it, and there's a lot of examples, but I think of a small place, let's say like Seychelles, where I had looks at Paris, they're like, I'm out. I don't even know how that relates to me. So I think sharing those lessons learned from the smaller communities, I think it's key. The other thing I want to pick up is that safety aspect and the education. And I do remember in the Sparrow project, we were trying to decide how fast the speed is we had designed slow zone in certain areas in the towns, and how fast it is outside of the slow zones. And there were, out of 5 of us, there were 2 women and 3 men, and we tested it. And the men all were like, let's go back to full speed. And the 2 women, one of which I'm like, no way, I feel like I'm falling off the scooter. So I think there's also a different perception, and we got to make sure that we have the right people at the design phase as well. Like that co-creation also means like, let's make sure we have as broad a community as possible when we're designing things. So we got the results of the poll. Ooh, this one is not as clear, apart from the infrastructure. And I think people resonated with that. But then incentives, education is equal, community ambassador the least, which I find very interesting personally, because I do know I resonate better if somebody looks like me and does the same thing. If I have to drop off my kid and somebody else is doing it in a campaign with a cargo bike, I'm like, oh, maybe I can do that too. Interesting. Quickly, incentives. I know I'm veering off our script, but that's okay. Incentives. We haven't talked about it, but subsidies and incentives. I really, maybe Ashley, you have some perspective, because I know you also really try hard to bring in those communities that are perhaps underserved. Works best there. Do you think we need to incentivize and subsidize to make the shift happen, or what is it that we need?
Yeah, so the city of Atlanta, like a lot of other North American cities, is looking into e-bike incentives right now, and if that would work for Atlanta. And I do think that incentives and subsidies for people purchasing their own e-bike can be a useful tool, and it's important. We also, going back to what I was saying earlier, so many neighborhoods in the city of Atlanta do not have safe infrastructure. All of the infrastructure is very auto-oriented, high speeds, multi-lane roads going through communities. And so while I think that e-bikes can be a great tool to connect to transit, to connect to work, some communities don't have the basic infrastructure to get them from point A to point B in a safe way. And so I'm not sure that, an incentive would be helpful when, it may not even be a mode that is safe for them to use at all. And I think that, we need to make sure our incentives are equitable, because if we're just increasing, more ridership in areas that already have wide adoption and high ridership and higher incomes, is that it's not really an equitable program, and is it that adding more access? So while I do think it's a positive thing and something we want to continue to look into, I think that can't exist in a vacuum. Like, we can't just say we're checking a box, like we're getting more people on e-bikes without really looking at what are we doing to do like pop-up projects to create temporary protected infrastructure. What are we doing in terms of like maybe neighborhood greenway development for people to sort of avoid some of the higher traffic, higher speed roads to get to their destinations or to get to transit? So I think that doesn't just exist in a vacuum, and we really have to look at our whole transportation system holistically to say, like, can we have a truly equitable incentive and subsidy program?
Yeah, and we have a question also from the audience, which kind of ties into what we're discussing right now. So I have Mukund working at Transdev Paris on microtransit for on-demand transport. They are obviously kind of in the intersection of transit, public transit, and micromobility. The challenge we see that there's less awareness in low density areas, and people just prefer cars than any other shared mobility service. There's a gap in the value chain, and how should we plan on bridging this gap to educate people towards more sustainable mobility forms? So this is really for everyone. Like, there's lots of options. We already, as I said, structure that we started talking about incentives, education. Like, what have you seen? Like, maybe Cassandra as well. I know you've worked in some of these smaller communities, and you mentioned the one where you bridged between public transit, the trains, and active mobility. What does it take to get people to shift?
I mean, it takes a mix of all of these things is the real answer. So, but looking at some of these smaller areas, it's the community ambassador communications is big. So our project that we did, the BTB one, we showed people dressed in, the idea was looking at commutes. So people, for example, in a Paris context, they might be living in suburban Paris. How do you get to your local train station? By bike for first last mile solutions. So everyone was dressed in business suits and with briefcases, which, to show that it's a normal thing to do. You can arrive to your meeting after being on a bike, and this is not something that you need to get all geared up and change. This is a normal step. It's faster, it's easier, you're saving time. So showing the benefits that way with communications campaigns, but also like you need to make the actual process faster. So having in more rural areas or more less dense areas, what's important is, I've just mentioned intermodality with trains, but we can create other types of transit hubs. That could be, if you don't have trains, so maybe there's a bus system where it's a park and ride, but make that park and ride equipped with bike sharing. Maybe there's a couple electric vehicle shares. Maybe there's showers. You can have covered secured bike parking, bike charging for electric bikes, lockers, information centers. I don't know, I've seen vending machines with bike parts and things to help repair your bike. So making these sort of hubs that just make it easy. Ultimately, the reason people in Copenhagen ride isn't because they're environmentalists or want to be extra healthy. It's because it's the easiest, simplest way to go. And if we don't show that, so in some of those areas that are convinced that the car is the only way to go, you need to tell the stories, show how it's easier, but then also have all these little details that make you need the infrastructure, you need the bike, but then you need the parking and all these other services that actually make the experience more pleasant and more accessible, and then people will ride if it's easier. Ultimately, that's what will happen.
We're all creatures of, we're creatures of habit. So we build a highway in our brain, and if the highway is like, I'm going in a car, then it's hard to shift. So we need to build a parallel highway,
right,
like literally in our brains. But I also, to your point, and it's the same on the shared mobility side. If it's easy, people will switch. If it requires mental effort to figure out how the hell am I even getting saved there, if it requires, like, as you said, I am worried about my e-bike that I just purchased with the rebate that's getting stolen, or parts are getting stolen where I park it, then I'm not it, like all of these things, right? So Jennifer, I do know that you've also thought and played around with the incentives piece. So I just want to bring it back and give you also a chance maybe to share like your perspective and learnings maybe there of what we should or maybe shouldn't do.
I think kind of just to step back a little bit back into the topic though, like a couple things are important here. One is that we start viewing this mode of transport as a real mode of transport. So I know they already do, Cassandra, in Copenhagen, that's excluding Copenhagen and some of those other fast movers. But like if you talk what Cassandra just said about the lockers and the safety and this, all these different things, right? In a lot of places, at least in Europe where they have public transport, all that stuff's included, right? You go to the train station, there's food there, there's lockers, there even maybe showers. there's all this stuff. And somehow we need to package this mode of transport kind of into that bucket, that it's a real mode of transport and we need to put these services behind it. It's not just a Friday night fun, thing I'm going to do instead of taking a taxi. And then when it comes to the incentive part, public transport is subsidized, so how, maybe this shouldn't be a for-profit business like the companies such as Lime or whoever, but maybe this should be offered in a different way. So it's maybe not a subsidy to the end customer per se, but it's packaged more as a real mode of transport, like we do. Here's a monthly ticket, and you can have unlimited rides, and then you can have these other services. What Cassandra said, and I think it's kind of packaging it a little bit in that way. Yeah. All
right. We do have another question from the audience, which I actually love because we haven't talked about this in panel yet. So I had to convince citizens to actually get on board. The other piece of the puzzle, and I'm learning this the hard way in this Connect the Coast cycling highway, is we actually have to convince the local officials to invest in this. The person, which is anonymous, says, my town has a 2030 master plan for transportation, and cycling occupies 1.5 pages of the 37 pages. So I think this is anybody's best guess answer. Actually, you work a lot with officials trying to convince them of the back and forth. How do we do that?
Yeah, so I think it's very difficult, and politics are politics and priorities change all the time. And so I think a lot of times you just have to show them data that is sometimes very difficult to look at. So looking at our Vision Zero data, looking at our high injury and casualty and fatalities, like showing them this data and saying, things can't stay like this because people are dying on our roads. They are unsafe. And just bringing them out to certain corridors and making them stand on a street corner while a car in a 30-mile-per-hour zone is going 50. And just saying, imagine walking across the street here with your child. Imagine, cycling with your child or your mother or someone just needing to go get groceries on this corridor. And to me, it's having those real life experiences, actually seeing it, talking to affected community members. That is really what changes people's minds. And it's sort of because there's always going to be pushback, and some of the, the loudest voices are the people fighting against safety projects. And I think that a lot of that goes back to, are we educating people enough on how important this is and the real life repercussions of not doing some of these safety projects. And so I think bringing that human element into it and being let's grab a shared e-bike and just ride this corridor together. And I think that always has a very major impact and has changed minds for sure.
I love that you just brought that up, because there is I can't remember which public transit company just did that. They put one of these stationary fitness bikes and then let the bus drivers, one bus driver sat on the bike pretending to pedal and the other bus driver drive past. It was to educate bus drivers how to pass safe. Made a huge difference for how they're passing bikes. So I love that you just brought that up. But Jennifer, I almost cut you off because I saw you not wanting to respond. So
yeah, we also had this topic when we were working with some different cities of how to convince them. And one thing that came up was the sensitivity around parking. And we just had to listen to them. And we had to listen, what are they afraid of? What is the big problem? And in this case, it was, you cannot take one parking spot. It was over their dead body. Would they do anything with a parking spot? And what we did is we said, okay, we won't take a single parking spot. And the thing is then we had to just be more creative in the design. In the end, they'll give up the parking spot. Yeah. But in the first step, we said, what is the biggest pain point that you have? And it was parking. And we said, okay, we're never going to touch a single, and with all these structures, there's lots of dead space actually in the city. Even in these parking lots, there's dead space where you can put a bike rack or whatever. So it was no problem. But I think just adding on to what Ashley said, you know, finding out what is their big issue, and then maybe compromising and kind of letting them have that for a while, and then maybe it changes over time.
Yeah, I agree with
So I'm
everything
running
else.
very close to the end of it. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead. No,
I
Cassandra,
was
go
just
ahead.
gonna add some important, because it is one of the most challenging things. You can have all the motivation you want, but if you don't have elected officials on board with you, you can't move forward. I think there's two things. One, if working with community organizations and helping who are for bicycles, we've seen a lot of action happen because they're pushing this and they're making sure to go to elected officials and they're staying there and staying true to the cause. But also, money speaks really loudly to a lot of elected officials. So, for example, I know Toronto they just published an article, but they looked at all the money that was made on the terraces where they had gotten rid of parking spots during COVID. And granted, yes, that's an isolated case, but there's study and after study after study is showing that when you put bicycle parking and remove car parking, there are economic returns that are important. You also have the advantage of people in cycling are more healthy. They're going to be less cost to a public health system. So you can start finding numbers, and there's stuff that's been published that's showing, and it's just cheaper to put a bike lane than it is to put a car. So you can start building up the economic argument for better health, saved healthcare costs, business stimulation, especially in smaller downtown areas. So those are things that have been effective, at least for us, is earnings and dollars. That always a powerful tool.
And I 100% agree. I sometimes find it funny because we never have to prove that our highways, you know, bring money, even though we spend so much. Like in Canada, it's like the majority of our budget, transportation budget, goes towards that, and 1% goes towards transportation. But I get it. Right now, we need to convince people that it has benefit. Since we're talking about economics and we're close to kind of wrapping up, I would, and we are in a little bit economic turbulent, maybe just generally turbulent times, like, you know, things shift under our feet on a constant basis. And I do remember from 2008, you know, I started with openness because it was an economic necessity all of a sudden for a lot of people. So can we seize this opportunity, like this really bizarre world we're in, kind of recession, inflation getting out of control? Is there an opportunity perhaps for us to also bring bikes and micromobility to more rural communities, piggybacking on that? So let me know your thought. It's your closing words. Give me your micromobility wish or e-bike wish for lower dense areas. And I'll start. I actually am going to start with Cassandra for once.
Yeah, I guess my wish for more dense area or less dense areas is just that they no longer are dependent on cars. Kind of like, why do we not ask about spending on highways? Why don't we ask about the fact that the car is just the default and it's okay, even though it causes lots of accidents? There's pollution. Economically, it's expensive. We know all the bad things about cars, but people are just okay with it. So to create a world where we can start prioritizing some of these different solutions, whether it's a transit hub that connects to a bus, but is in a rural area, just to make it so that this dependence on a specific expensive vehicle isn't the only option. So yes, it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of motivation. Yeah.
I'm going to prompt you on the Copenhagen story, because because we're exactly changing the paradigm, but partly also due to economic necessity.
Yeah, so it is. So it's, our whole point in when we say Copenhagenize, it's not putting the same exact bike lanes and brick everywhere. The whole idea is that we want to flip the way we're thinking about things and shift the paradigm. So rather than thinking about how many cars can we move through space, we're trying to think about how can we move humans through space. And if we start prioritizing public transit, even carpooling, if we want to throw it in there, but specifically active transit and public transit, we can see you can move 10 times more people through a space. It also helps redistribute space more equitably, because we've mentioned one parking space in the downtown that serves one person Whereas if that becomes bike parking for 20 or a terrace where there's seating or a park, that's going to give more access to public space to more people. So those things we're talking about more in urban settings, but we can apply those same lessons to more rural areas. So I think we see a lot of, I think we talked about it. What is it? Need is the invention is often caused by lack of having things. So right now, it is cheaper to put a bicycle highway, even the most expensive one, is going to be less than $1 million a kilometer, whereas roads are going to start there. So we're looking at a cheaper investment, cheaper to actually access these vehicles. So it is a moment where I think a shift can happen because people are going to see their pocketbooks positively impacted. So it is a moment to seize. And then it'll just help with this shift to be less dependent upon cars.
So Jennifer, what's your wish?
My wish is that, because for this whole thing, I think to really work, we need money and like priority on the topic. And I can just tell you from the investor perspective, it's struggling in this field, right? And it's focused on high growth, kind of not the right products and approach that we would want for sustainable mobility. We don't want the cheapest products that are all coming from Asia. We want, high quality products that are durable, that are safe. Maybe that even creates some economic growth in the area where you're serving those communities. But for all of this to happen, we need money. And so I think a lot of people need to kind of come to the table, and the investors, I think, will be more apt to come to the table when the cities make bolder commitments and also put some money there. For me, that's my big wish, is that we kind of come to the table also with the money that's needed to do this. And I think with the investor community, we're not going to see them investing in low dense areas. You're just not going to see it. It goes against the business model. And then we're going to be not supporting that where it's needed most. But that would change if one of those communities or areas, right, are putting skin in the game and saying, hey, this is what we put in, investors could come in, and then you could make a whole different thing. But in the end, I'd like to see the money come that allows the infrastructure, allows the right products, allows it to be equitable for the end consumer, allows it to be competitive with public transport, all of those things. That would be my wish.
All right. I like it. Ashley.
Yeah, and just going off what Jennifer said, I mean, my wish is similar. I want to see more public, federal, state, and local dollars going to both shared micromobility, but also just micromobility and e-bikes and e-scooters in general, and really seeing that be a priority and seeing that need to have real mode shift be a priority, and looking not just at EVs as being sort of the cure-all for our, climate woes, but looking at specifically like e-bikes and smaller devices as really playing a huge role in that. So that's sort of one part. And then sort of specifically for Atlanta, like I would love to see a push for better land use in some of our decisions, which is a much bigger conversation, but very important in the city and something we definitely need to see. We actually, while we are a lesser dense city, we need more density. And so just hoping that, we can make some of those land use changes to connect some of our communities and really improve on both land use and our infrastructure, connecting our communities and allowing all of our residents of all ages to be able to get where they need to go safely outside of a car and connect to our transit system as well. And there's a lot of work to do on that.
Yeah, I think that's the key I'm hearing. I have a few minutes to kind of wrap up. And what I would like to do is just summarize. I think I have 6 kind of key lessons that I wrote down. How we said at the beginning, yes, we can bring bikes or the bike revolution or the micromobility revolution to lower density areas, but buts. And so here's what I wrote down. Collaboration and co-creation is at the heart of bringing micromobility or bikes to lesser dense cities. We have to focus on or build the network, the connected network. And what I also heard is like, let's not get perfection in the way of the possible. You know, be ready, shovel ready probably for when and if the shift on the financial side happens and you can get grant to build the network, but let's not get that in the way. I also heard that we need to show the hard data and get politicians and officials to experience choose, but possibly the freedom of shifting to a different type of vehicle and show the economic benefits. So we all, I think, collaboratively and collectively, we all have to work constantly on showing that. And then the last 2 points, focus on the different form factors that are more durable, more accessible to a wider variety of users, because when you get to lower dense areas and you have less of a network, and you may have to possibly use trails, which is the case in our area, then you need a different form factor that's more robust, right? And incorporate education ambassadors to help behavior change. And I'm thinking here specifically of some of the I don't know if it's underserved, but less represented, like families with kids, they always jump off the bandwagon and go back to their car. Seniors or older adults that can be part of this just as much, especially with different form factors, right? So we have to incorporate them also in what we show. Representation matters, I guess, even here. And then my only takeaway, my last personal takeaway that I've learned the hard way over the last 13 years, things takes time and it takes a lot of patience. 13 years ago, I did not have as much patience. That's my last personal one. And if I wish for us as a collective not to give up, because it takes time to make that shift. So with that all said, we have 1 minute to spare. Thank you so much, Morgana. I'll let you come back. I think you want to have the closing word. Thank you, panelists, for discussing this. Has been wonderful. And you're in a halo, Morgane. So I don't know if that was the intention.
No, absolutely not. This is not how it was showing up in the beginning. I'm so sorry if I'm spooking anybody out right now. Don't, you know what, I'll just turn off my camera in this case. But yeah, thank you, Sandra, for expertly moderating the conversation on this really important topic. Thank you, Ashley, Jennifer, and Cassandra. Really awesome insights from all of you. And thank you to the attendees for showing up today from wherever in the world you are. If you've enjoyed today's session, you may also enjoy our Fast Forward podcast by CoMotion. You can listen to it in all our podcatchers. Our most recent episode, Rewiring Cities with Electric Shuttles, is a great convo with Alex Esposito, CEO and co-founder of Circuit. Check it out to find out more about their electric fleets that are ferrying people up and down the main drags of cities and towns such as Santa Monica, Dallas, Miami, and the Hamptons. So again, thank you everybody for joining us, and I hope to see you next month in February for our next CoMotion Live episode. Have a great rest of your night, evenings, mornings, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.